loved and lost. In war, there are no winners. Wes held the receiver so tight that the plastic creaked in his iron grip.
What do you mean you got nothing?
I'm sorry, Mr. Perkins. Sometimes these things take time.
The private eye's voice crackled and faded, his cell phone connection as poor as ever.
I tracked them to Memphis, but then the trail went cold. She might be here, working for cash, staying under the radar, or she might have headed for a big city, like New York.
Wes gritted his teeth, his jaw tight and aching, as if he had chewed on an entire half-pound bag of House of Jerky in one go. His free hand clenched as hard as the one holding the receiver, and he could feel his short, stubby fingernails digging deep into the flesh of his palm.
It's up to you,
the private eye said, as if he didn't have a care in the world.
But I'll need another $2,000 if you want me to keep working the case.
How he wanted to reach through the phone line and rip the smug little bastard's throat out. He had damn near zeroed out his savings as it was, and now with his boss cutting his hours down to 30 hours a week, until the financial crisis blew over, he had even less coming in. Where the hell could he find another $2,000?
Keep looking.
He ground it out, his knuckles showing white on his left hand. He opened his fist and counted the 4 crescent moon shapes his fingernails had left in his skin. The line crackled, and the private eye sighed.
Mr. Perkins, I'll need that deposit by tomorrow evening.
Stay in Memphis. Find them. You'll get your goddamn money.
He slammed the receiver down and punched the wall. The drywall, which was already sporting a sizable dent from the last time he had hit it, crumbled, leaving a gaping hole. A splinter of wood from the edge of the stud dug a gouge into his hand.
Fucking shit!
He stumbled away from the phone, his mind spinning on how he was going to generate $2,000 by the end of the day tomorrow. He tripped over a Powerpuff doll and slammed his hip into Laura's beloved roll-top desk. It rocked back and forth, and a figurine of a dolphin that Cody had given her last year for Mother's Day fell and smashed on the floor, breaking into several pieces. Wes limped into the small dark hallway cursing and fumbled for the light switch. Nothing happened when he flipped the switch on, which wasn't surprising. The rolling blackouts had become more frequent in recent weeks, and it seemed like the power was off more than it was on these days. The sharp edge of the medicine cabinet raked his hand, and he fumbled in the dark for a box of Band-Aids, only to find the damned box was empty. Fucking kids. He muttered and tossed the box, now smeared with blood, toward one of the children's rooms. Sarah had probably used the last of them on her baby dolls or herself. The smallest of wounds, imaginary or real, were instantly solved by his daughter raiding the medicine cabinet for a Band-Aid. He wiped his bloody hand on his pants and walked back into the living room, grabbed a bottle of whiskey from the corner table where he had put a serious dent in it the evening before, and settled into his easy chair to drink some more. The fridge was empty, and he had finished off the last of the canned soup and crackers on Sunday. Fuck it. Whiskey for dinner sounds just fine to me. He didn't bother with a glass, just tossed the cap in the general direction of the overflowing trash can and tipped the bottle up to his lips, feeling the liquid burn as it slid down his throat. In some ways, having Laura and the kids gone was pretty damn nice. No nervous looks from Laura or the kids, no scuttling about like they had something to hide or were somehow scared of him sitting there. No complaints about how there wasn't enough money to buy food because he'd gone and bought an economy size of the Jim Beam, or her pursing her lips in disapproval like his mom used to do to his dad. It has to be a thing they all learn at their mother's knee, that tight-lipped look that gave the appearance of a stick being firmly shoved up their asses, while simultaneously saying without words what a disappointment a man is to them. All the women I've ever seen had that look mastered. Like it's a fucking art or something. He took another hard swallow. The alcohol burned less this time, and he could feel the slow heat spreading from his stomach to his limbs, loosening the angry set of his shoulders. 4 weeks now, and not a goddamn word. No phone call. The bank account hadn't been touched, and that damned useless private eye had lost them in Memphis. They had stayed in a run-down roach motel for 2 days, cash-only transaction. Wes knew that much, but the private eye had fucked it all up, spooked Laura before he could get off of his shift at the plant and head for the address. He was left holding his balls, the television in the corner still warm and set to channel 39, the Disney Channel. He'd only hit Laura that one time. Hell, he'd apologized, brought her flowers, everything. But it hadn't mattered. He'd seen the wary look in her eyes, and she tiptoed around for 2 days before taking the kids and disappearing, poof, with no one willing to look him in the eye up at the police station or help him fill out a missing persons report.
Ain't a missing person if they leave of their own volition, the deputy had said. Go home, Perkins. Maybe she'll come around. Things are really tough right now. She'll have a hard time finding work. Hell, she'll be back with the kids before you know it.
But she hadn't been back, and the house wasn't the same without the kids squabbling over who got to watch what, or Laura in the kitchen whipping up something amazing.
Did I tell that private dick to check the diners and cafes? She could have gotten a job as a cook, easy as pie. She was that good.
He frowned, downed another jolt of liquid medication, and jumped to his feet at the loud backfire that sounded outside on the street. Standing there, Wes swayed a little, unsure of why he was standing there or why his heart was pounding so damned hard, his pulse jumping in his neck, the hairs on his arm pricking up.
Just old Dowsy's car backfiring. Nothing to worry about.
He sat back down. It had been like that ever since he'd come home from Afghanistan. A loud noise, a car crash, or siren. Hell, it was a fucking mess when 4th of July came around. His hand ached and the blood was drying, except around the wound, which continued to leak. He looked down at his dingy white shirt. It was covered with red smudges of blood. That would have set Cody off big time. Laura had been worried he had autism or Asperger's or some kind of fucked up syndrome of some kind. When the kids saw blood, he freaked the fuck out.
That's what comes of having a woman raise your son while you're off killing sand niggers and defending America.
His lip curled in disdain at the memory of Cody losing his shit in Walmart when Sarah fell down and got a bloody nose. She was crying, but Cody, 2 years older and lacking the balls a boy his age should have, had started screaming bloody murder over the blood on his sister's dress. Wes had taken him into the men's bathroom and backhanded him, shocking the boy into silence.
And Al Lord giving me the look then, as if it was my fault the boy had no balls and screamed like a girl over blood.
Wes hit the bottle again, then again, until suddenly the last drops were dribbling out on his tongue and everything felt warm and fuzzy, a nice big blur that intensified as he tried, and failed, to stand up. He tried again, and the room tilted as he wobbled towards the dark hallway. The last light of the day was pouring in through the living room windows, cloaking the room in red, and he heard the hum of the electric start up, the fridge motor turning on, as if after hours of being off and a checkered past 2 weeks of infrequent electrical spikes, there would be anything inside worth preserving any longer. He wove his way into the bathroom, belching as he peed into the toilet. The light in the bathroom was dim, probably because all but one of the 3 light bulbs had burned out. He turned and tried digging in the closet for a box of bulbs. He was sure it was in there somewhere, and just as quickly as the lights had come on, they flickered once, twice, and were down again. Wes backed up, but not far enough. In the pitch black and in his drunken state, he stood up too soon and cracked his head on the shelf above. He didn't see stars so much as streaks of hot white light burning across his retinas, his head exploding with pain. Fuck! He fell back, the ground tilting and moving under him, and passed out on the floor of the bathroom, too drunk to try to find his way back to the living room or the empty bed. Dawn came stealing in from the east, lighting up the hallway in a weak orange light. But the dawn wasn't what had woken him. The impatient honk of the truck outside had. Wes groaned and clutched his head as Maynard pounded on the front door and rang the doorbell. "Perkins!" He could hear his friend's muffled yell. "We're gonna be late!" Wes struggled to his feet, removing the Hot Wheels car that had slid up his pant leg and lodged painfully against his ankle. It clattered and slipped away, banging into the far wall. He winced. The back of his head had a lump where he had slammed it into the shelf, but that was the least of his ailments. His tongue felt thick and coated, swollen, yet also dry and parched, and his injured hand ached, the wound having finally stopped bleeding. The weak sunlight filtering in was enough for him to see his reflection, and he instantly wished he hadn't. He looked like hell. He looked worse than that. Eyes sunken, dark smudges under them like he'd been in a fight, and his lips cracked. He stood there, shaky, a sour taste in his mouth, and his teeth were coated with gunk.
How long's it been since I brushed my teeth or took a damn shower?
Maynard pounded again, and then thought to try the door. It was unlocked, of course. In a town the size of Tiptonville, everyone knew everyone. You needn't bother locking your doors. Maynard turned the handle and walked in, saw Wes shuffling out of the bathroom, and shook his head in disgust.
Christ, Perkins! You ever give that whiskey bottle a break? We're gonna be late to work, and you look like the Walking Dead. What the hell? Did you forget we got the early shift the rest of this week?
Wes flapped his hand and shuffled to the bedroom.
Give me 5 minutes. I gotta change my clothes.
It took 7 minutes, and Maynard revved the engine of his truck as Wes slid into the passenger seat.
I can't afford to be late, man. You're gonna have to find someone else to take you if you do this again to me.
Wes mumbled under his breath, and his friend looked at him, his lips set in a thin line before he squealed the tires and pulled out of the gravel drive with an impatient jerk. The plant was just to the north of town, and there was no traffic to speak of. The men were silent, Maynard fiddling with the dial on the radio the entire way, flipping incessantly from channel to channel. They made it with 1 minute to spare, sliding into one of the last parking spaces left in the small lot.
Best avoid the boss man. You reek of whiskey,
Maynard said in a low voice as they approached the building. His warning, however, was in vain. Boss man, also known as Ethan Hurlbutt, the owner of Hurlbutt Manufacturing, was waiting at the door. Maynard nodded at the man.
Morning, boss.
And he sidled past. Wes wasn't as lucky.
Perkins, if I could have a word.
The older man's face was grim, and Wes felt his guts twist. Maynard threw him a sidelong glance that spoke of pity mixed with unease and scuttled out of sight around the corner. Wes could hear the punch of the clock seconds later and the far door open, releasing the loud hum of machinery before clicking shut behind his friend. He knew he would not be walking onto the floor today, and possibly any other day. He licked his lips, which felt dry, stretched, as if the whiskey had sucked every ounce of water out of him. Hell, his skin felt so dry that his eyeballs ached in their sockets. He hadn't felt this bad coming off a drunk since Afghanistan, and the IED that had blown up his patrol vehicle, sending him to the hospital with a concussion, lacerations, and a week's stay in the infirmary, and he had been the lucky one.
Don't bother. I got a feeling about where this is heading,
he rasped, glaring at Ethan Hurlbutt. Boss man had spent time in the Marines, been drafted into a stint in Vietnam, and then re-upped for one more tour. When he had come back, he had taken over Hurlbutt Manufacturing from his dad after the old man suffered a massive heart attack and died in the dingy cafeteria directly under a hand-painted sign that read, "Here at Hurlbutt, we don't haul ass, we hurl butt." And Ethan ran a tight ship. A lesser man, a man who hadn't served his country like Wes had, wouldn't have lasted a month coming to work hungover. But Boss Man had watched Wes, even given him an advance 2 weeks ago so he could hire the private dick, and even let him take off that one day to find Laura and the kids in Memphis.
Wes, I've been where you're at,
Hurlbutt began.
Save it for someone else, boss. I don't need an intervention. No, you need to stop killing yourself, which is what you're doing. And I can't have you operating machinery when you're still sauced from the night before. No can do.
Wes waved a hand, weaving slightly as he walked away, heading for the road.
Right, got it.
He didn't look back, but he could feel Boss Man's eyes on him. The walk back to town took most of an hour. It gave him time to think about how fucked he was.
No wife or kids, no job, no fucking money.
He sobered up as he walked, the May sun warming his bones, the brightness of it painful at first. He stopped when he got to Main Street, and instead of heading home, he walked into the Sinclair gas station and dug into his pockets for the wrinkled dollar bills he had dug out of Cody's piggy bank that morning before getting in the truck with Maynard. Leslie Cobain and her husband Phil owned the gas station. They alternated shifts, and it was Leslie's turn to man the station. She looked up with a smile that faltered at the sight of Wes. "Hey there, Wes. You look like you've been through the ringer," she clucked her tongue. "I heard about Laura and the kids. You had any luck on that yet?" Wes knew it was all over town.
Hell, can't take a dump without the entire fucking town hearing about it.
He shook his head, his mouth dry as a bone. Well, grab a cup of joe and sit for a bit. He didn't want to head back to an empty house. He had no job to go to, and Wes couldn't remember the last time he'd just sat and talked to anyone. He grabbed a cup of coffee, added a couple of pieces of ice to cool it off enough to drink, and pulled up a stool next to the counter. He had dated Leslie for a few months in high school. It hadn't been serious, a casual friendship that got a little hot and heavy, and then, once the anticipation was done and over, had dwindled back to casual again. Phil wasn't the jealous type. A year ahead of Wes and Leslie, he had been friendly, and Wes and Laura had been invited to several get-togethers over the years. Hell, Phil had drunk him under the table a few years back now. So, how are you, Wes?
Shit, you got eyes. Feel like hot shit bagged in a layer of lava.
Leslie wasn't blind, and he knew he looked like hell. She laughed and stood up, walked to a cooler and grabbed 3 large Smart Water bottles and 2 orange Gatorade, then set them down on the counter in front of him. On the house. You'll feel better if you can flush some of that whiskey out of your system.
Hell, whiskey's a food group, Les, didn't you know?
Her eyes were kind, full of empathy. Drinking it like it's water isn't going to bring Laura and the kids back. He cracked open one of the Gatorade bottles and downed half of it in one go. He could feel his body sucking it in, felt the cells expand, and his skin felt a little less tight.
Well, now that I'm fired, I got nothing to buy any more with anyhow.
His headache, although still a whopper, began to ease off. His stomach growled, loud and long, and Leslie looked amused as she tossed him a bag of jerky. You'll be in good company soon enough. Ethan doesn't have the funds to keep anyone on after the 18th anyway. All this financial mess, the power issues, and more, she shook her head, is going to get worse before it gets better. Wes took a piece of jerky and began to gnaw on it. The taste of the teriyaki-flavored meat filled his mouth and soothed his angry stomach.
What you heard?
Mostly it's been through Phil when he's up at the clinic getting his dialysis treatments. They are saying things are going to get a whole hell of a lot worse soon. Wes shrugged.
Economy goes up, it comes down, goes back up again. Big fucking cycle. What's to worry about?
Before Leslie could answer, the question struck him.
Hey, wait. What's going on with Phil that he needs dialysis?
Leslie's face twisted in pain. Her lips quivered a little as she tried to smile, to put a brave face on her fears. His kidneys are failing, and his liver is starting to fail. What with all that's going on in the world, the list of donors has dropped off, especially here in flyover country. The doc says it's likely they won't find a donor liver in time, so he's got maybe 3, 6 months if we're lucky.
Jesus, Les. I'm sorry.
He reached out and took the woman's hand, his mind reeling at the thought of Phil, full of life, father of 4, dying. Hell, they weren't even middle age.
This shit isn't supposed to happen in our 30s, damn it.
She shrugged helplessly. It was the drinking. He drank like a fish for years. Nobody really saw it. He started in high school and just never really stopped. I don't know why I didn't say something, do something, especially after seeing my dad and my mom kill themselves slowly. Instead, I was living with it, covering for him, enabling him instead of drawing a line in the sand. I covered for him here at home, and it just got bad, really bad. And one day he went in for a checkup. He hadn't been feeling well, been vomiting blood, peeing blood, the works, and they told him he was going to die if he didn't change his ways. Overnight, he changed. He checked himself into English Mountain, that rehab center up in the Eastern Hills, and he got himself clean and sober. It was amazing and wonderful. I got my husband back, the kids got their daddy back, and things were good, better than good, till late last year. There were tears in her eyes. And now, well, now I get to watch him die, just when things were turning around. Wes squeezed her hand, unsure what to say, when suddenly Leslie grabbed his hand and held onto it with a strength that took him by surprise. You only get this one life, Wes. This one, here and now. You can waste it, or you can make the best of it. Before he could reply, there were voices shouting, a flurry of activity from down the street near the Trade Mart. What the hell is happening now? Leslie asked, her eyebrows furrowed as she stared out of the glass. A handful of men and women, more than the usual group that held court in front of the Trade Mart, and smoked cigarettes and gossiped were gathering. One of the women shook her head, and Wes and Leslie could hear her shouting, "No! No! No! The news reports are wrong! They have to be!" Wes stared at Leslie.
We better go see what's going on.
2 months later. Wes untied the body of the deer from the pole. He had gas in the truck, but instead of driving, he had walked the 10 miles, choosing to enjoy the stars and camp for a day or two before taking the buck, field dressing it, and returning to town. He'd spent the past 2 months clean and sober, even though the DTs had hit him hard soon after the news of the limited nukes in Austin and D.C. had come out. That day, standing there in front of the Trade Mart, listening to the scant and often contradictory news coming over the radio, reality had struck him like a freight train. Thanks to his PTSD and heavy drinking, he had lost Laura, Cody, and Sarah, most likely forever. There was no way of finding them, no clues as to their whereabouts. Thanks to the collapse, the United States was in shambles, the government gone, and rumors of civil war were spreading. The country he had known, the one he had gone to a foreign land filled with sand and violence to defend, was no more. There in the gravel driveway, he glanced up and saw Leslie sitting on his front stoop. She looked as if she had aged 10 years in the last 2 months. But then again, losing your husband and your only way of making a living thanks to the collapse will do that to you. No tankers to bring gas, as of a month ago, no gas to sell. And Leslie had finally just walked away from the gas station. The shelves were empty by then. Nothing to sell, certainly nothing to steal, and she had sat by Phil's side until he drew his last breath. Wes had been bringing her hunks of meat since May. He knew that others were helping in whatever way they could as well.
Hey there, Les. I got a nice-sized back haunch for you.
He eased the carcass down off of the sling. A combination of metal poles, wheels, and a heavy-duty tarp had made hauling the deer back to town relatively easy. As it was, he was feeling more fit than he had since his high school days. He spent most of his time hunting, alone in the woods, outside of town, and the isolation had helped. Having meat helped. He traded it for other things, like produce from the Purdue's farm, or the heavy home-style bread that Sadie brought every Tuesday and Friday to the Trade Mart, to barter for her family's other needs. Leslie smiled, a small one that faded fast. She looked tired. No big surprise there. She had 4 little ones to look after, and her husband hadn't been gone 3 weeks now. Hanging in there, Wes. She looked at the deer carcass. No head?
I already dropped it off at the Purdue's on my way in. Old man says he's going to make head cheese with it, and the tongue.
Leslie nodded. I wasn't coming by for meat, although it's kind of you to offer, but I wanted you to come to the 4th of July picnic folks are planning for tomorrow.
Wes snorted. 4th of July? Hell, there ain't no 4th of July anymore.
Don't be silly. Of course there is. She waved a hand in the direction of Main Street. Hell, I know how you feel. Not really up to a picnic myself, but it'll be good for the kids. They haven't been out much since the funeral.
Yeah, well, I ain't going.
Wes, stop it. You cleaned yourself up, everyone can see that, and some of the menfolk, they've been asking about your military experience. We could use a militia, in case those rumors turn into something more. You got training, experience.
Yeah, Wes snorted. I got real good at getting shot at.
Don't be a pain in the ass, Wes Perkins. Come to the picnic and bring some ribs. You need to be a part of the community. This town could use your expertise. She stood then, and she moved slower than she should at her age. I'll expect to see you there. The next day had dawned, and with it storm clouds on the horizon. Wes looked out the window and thought of what Leslie had said. She'd been right about his drinking, and she was probably right now. He hated the 4th of July. At least he had these past 5 years or so, back from Afghanistan, where a damn car backfiring had him on his feet looking for an attack. The rumors that were swirling of the supremacist militias and the malcontented remnants of soldiers left unpaid and leaderless in the economic collapse, all of it added up to bad news. Wes cinched his belt a notch tighter. He'd lost 2 waist sizes since Laura had left, taking her mad cooking skills with her. He ate meat, usually jerky, and wasn't drinking, so the extra pounds he had put on since he'd been overseas had melted off.
Hell, Maybe I can fit into a size large shirt again.
He dug into the back of the closet and found a stack of old shirts Laura had put away when he drank enough to make them too tight. His mouth quirked up at the third one down from the top. An outrageous red and yellow Hawaiian shirt, garish in design. It had been a Father's Day present shortly after he'd returned from overseas. Back when things were still good, or relatively so, a time when Laura had still loved him. He slipped it on, buttoned it up, and felt his mouth turning up in a happy grin. The first one in months. It fit. It actually fit well.
Fuck it, I'll go. It'll shock the shit out of most of those gossipy old busybodies to see me show my face.
He glanced at his reflection in the mirror, and his smile slipped as he thought of Laura and the kids. Chances were, he might never see them again. He had hoped, when things got bad, that they would come back. He dreamed of it, waking up in the middle of the night sure he had heard Sarah's voice or Cody's husky whisper, the one where they think they are being quiet but instead are shout whispering. But there had been nothing. No sign of them, not even a postcard or letter, before the mail service had shut down completely. They were gone, and he was here in this empty house, reminded of them at every turn, reminded of how he had failed to be the husband and father they deserved. Hours later, as he stood on the edges of the crowd, the rack of ribs he had brought slowly browning on the large grill that had been set up in the middle of the street, he found himself questioning why he had come. Most of the women wouldn't meet his glance, and the men were all gathered in a group, with Ethan Hurlbut at the center, talking about starting a town militia. Leslie had come over, smiled and squeezed his arm, gave him a small hug before having to run off and deal with her youngest, 4-year-old Eva, who had fallen down and had a nasty scrape. The girl was wailing, a mess of tears and snot, over a tiny little patch of blood on her knee. He stood there alone. His shirt felt like a damned neon sign that proclaimed, "Look at me. My wife left me and took my kids thanks to me being a drunken asshole. Another hunt in the woods sounds really good right about now." "Hi." Wes blinked. The woman standing in front of him could not be talking to him. He looked around, first to the left and then the right, before he turned back to her. Her lips twitched in what could only be amusement.
"Me?"
She said nothing, but a smile grew on her face. She handed him a slice of cake tilting on a cheap paper plate. "Leslie said that lemon cake is your favorite. I'm Angie, by the way." She tipped her head back towards the group of women, where Leslie was holding her youngest. Leslie looked up, winked at him, and smiled before returning to petting Eva's hair and wiping the last of the little girl's tears away.
"Dessert before dinner? Why the hell not?" Thanks?"
Wes took the cake from her and managed a weak smile in return.
"I'm Wes."
He took a bite of the cake. It was delicious. How long had it been since he'd eaten lemon cake? At least 6 months, probably longer. It wasn't as moist as Laura's, but still. The light shifted, dimmed. The clouds that had been in the distance had finally moved in, and the day took on an unprecedented coolness as the storm began to move in, thunder beginning to rumble. "Uh-oh." Angie looked up, grinning. "Looks like we're about to get some real weather." The way she said it, her odd accent, and the fact that her face wasn't familiar, reeled Wes in. He stepped closer.
"Where are you from? Not from around here, I'm guessing."
"No," she said, shaking her head. She cocked it sideways and grinned like a fool at the darkening sky. "California. I was visiting friends, and, well, things went to hell, and I figured, why not stay here for a while?" She turned away and studied the clouds, her eyes examining them as they roiled and moved, the wind picking up her hair, blowing it. Behind them, folks were scrambling to pull the tables inside of the Trade Mart. Even the grill was being moved to under the overhang of the building as fat drops of rain began to fall.
"You act like you'd never seen rain before."
He shoveled half of the cake into his mouth, watching her with obvious delight. She turned back. "There's plenty of rain, but without the thunder and lightning. Just a downpour, no light show." Her grin stretched impossibly wide. Her teeth were uneven but bright white. "Do you think we might get a tornado?" She said it with a hopeful look, eyes wide with excitement. She jumped as a streak of lightning lit up the horizon and thunder boomed.
"I think we're more likely to get hit by lightning if we stay here."
He swallowed the last of the cake, licking his fingers.
"Come on, let's get under cover."
Without thinking, he took her hand and led her away, not towards the Trade Mart, but towards home. It was instinctual. He'd been ready to run when faced with the crowd already, and somehow, having just met her, he didn't want to say goodbye. She didn't question it, didn't look nervous, just laughed as the rain began to fall, heavy, and their feet were soon splashing through puddles as they ran through the side streets. The heavens let loose as they made it to his door. The rain hammered the roof, filling the gutters and gushing over as it overwhelmed their capacity. In one section, the water poured in a solid line where Cody had dented the spot of guttering over the eaves with a football the year before. The kid might be a pansy over the sight of blood, but he was strong. "Wow, that changed from sunny to downpour and nothing flat," Angie laughed, pulling at her soaked t-shirt and wiping at the drips that ran in rivulets from her hairline. She looked around the living room, and Wes felt a wave of embarrassment crash through him. What had he been thinking when he brought her here? The bottles of Jim Beam were all gone, but he hadn't cleaned, not once, since Laura and the kids left. Dirty laundry lay scattered on the floor, a pile of dirty dishes covered the coffee table, and he was suddenly acutely aware that he hadn't cracked a window to let fresh air in. It smelled almost feral, as if he had brought her to a wolf's den, not a home. He grabbed a tall candle, a floral-scented one Laura had liked so much, and lit it with a match. He shook the box. He was down to the last handful of them. Hopefully, he could pick up a box at the Trade Mart next time he had some meat and skins to trade. Wes was surprised to find he felt nervous, worried the stranger would want to leave as quickly as she had arrived.
I didn't really think about how messy it was in here.
You weren't expecting a strange woman to come home with you? Her face was guileless, and she cocked her head to one side, assessing him with her warm brown eyes.
Yeah, I guess so.
He paused suddenly out of his depth.
Is that what we were doing here?
She threw her head back and laughed. It rang out so bright and melodic that he was shocked by it. You tell me, Wes. You led the way. I just followed along. He felt attraction then, a strong pull of it. It wasn't just the fact that a real live woman was standing in his living room, that she could have taken home top spot in a wet t-shirt contest, or that he hadn't had any for longer than he could remember. There was something about her. She was confident, yet not brash. She smiled at him, and he felt like he could lose himself in that smile. It reminded him of how Laura had looked in the early days, when the first blush of their love had been simple and overwhelming and pure, before Afghanistan, before Cody, and responsibilities and bills had replaced those hedonistic moments of making love on his narrow futon in a sun-drenched apartment with neighbors bickering on the other side of the wall. Before the explosions and the whiskey he drank to keep his nerves from feeling like white-hot pokers in his brain. He smiled back at her, felt the unfamiliar stretch as the corners of his mouth lifted up. She nodded then. That's better. You looked so solemn before. The smile looks good on you. It slipped then, and he looked away.
I'm not so good with people these days.
She stepped closer, reached up and touched his cheek. Really? Maybe just haven't been with the right people. She leaned in, her breath smelling of lemon cake, and kissed him lightly on the lips. He returned the favor by putting his arms around her, pulling her close, and losing himself in a deep, passionate kiss. He slept late that next morning for the first time in forever, opening his eyes to hear Angie moving about in the living room, humming away. She had stayed the whole night, and the sun was pouring in the bedroom window, promising a hot, muggy morning after the odd weather of the day before. He stretched, listening. What was she doing? He sat up, grabbed his jeans, and slipped them on. Her back was to him, and she gave a small yip of surprise when he spoke, jumping as she turned, toys filling her hands. He looked around the living room, saw it neat and clean, the dishes washed, the tables cleared. You're awake. She looked down at the toys in her hands. I'm an early riser and, well, she shrugged. I like to clean. I hope you don't mind. He didn't, and realized his face probably told her something different. The scent of meat cooking got his stomach rumbling, though, and it let out a large, low growl. Angie laughed, another one of her carefree musical laughs that had him grinning in return. He scuffed his bare feet on the floor.
I guess I worked up an appetite last night.
Her eyes widened, eyebrows arching, her grin infectious. Same here. I'm positively starving. It felt strange to see her in Laura's spot at the table, but as she talked about the life she had left in California, it was so expensive to live there, and her life here in Tennessee. Did you know that cows actually do that? He found that she fit in some odd, refreshing way. After breakfast, they sat on the front porch, and she waved at Dowsey as he walked past, his decrepit Buick neatly put away in the garage. The old man was pushing 90. He'd lived on his own since his wife of 65 years had passed the year before, and he still didn't even need glasses. He nodded at the two of them and kept on walking. "Tell me about your family," Angie asked, matter of fact, right to the point. Wes stared at her.
I imagine you've heard the stories.
She shrugged. "I'd rather hear it from you."
Yep, and this is when she's gonna hightail it out of here. Laura, my wife, she took Cody and Sarah and left about 4 months ago now. I hired a private eye to try to find them, and he got close. By the time I got to the motel in Memphis, they were gone, and there's been no word since.
He paused.
Is that about what you heard?
Angie nodded and then asked, "Would you consider yourself a good husband and father?"
She's direct, a woman after my own heart.
He drew in a breath and let it out, sighed.
No, I wouldn't. I tried to be. I really did. But I fucked up. I drank too much, yelled at the kids, and I lost my temper with Laura. She didn't deserve it. Not one bit of it.
He looked away down the road, wondered where they were, whether they were okay, if they were safe. He wondered if he would ever know the truth.
She did what she had to do, to be safe, to be a good parent to the kids. She did it because I wasn't changing, and the situation was getting worse, not better. I was mad as hell, ready to drag her back by her hair if I found her. I lost my job, lost most of my friends, and I've sat alone in this house and wished I had another chance to make it right.
He stared into the distance, afraid to look at the woman by his side. She sighed, too, and slipped her hand into his. It was small, delicate. "Thank you, Wes, for your honesty." He snorted and shook his head.
And now is when you're going to run for the hills, right?
She laughed and bumped her shoulder against his. "Nah, I think I'll stay a while if you don't mind." Relief flooded through him. He'd been lonely, and there was something about Angie that captivated him. His voice was gruff.
I don't mind.
Good. They sat there in silence and listened to the town wake up around them. 4 months later.
I fixed you the last of the tea.
Wes set a steaming mug down on the dining room table and turned back to his packs. The first cold snap and a hunting trip were long overdue. He added his fletching knife, which he had sharpened the evening before. Angie's hair, normally neatly coiffed in a bun, was in disarray, and she was still in a nightshirt, a thick woven blanket around her shoulders, her knees drawn up to her chest, heels balanced on the worn wood of the chair, a faraway look in her eyes. Wes looked back at her. She hadn't touched the tea.
You okay?
He pulled up a chair, sat down next to her. Something was wrong. She looked up, uncharacteristically somber. He attempted a smile.
I suppose you could keep your nightshirt on while hunting and just flash the deer. The shock of it might keep them from bolting.
A corner of her mouth twitched, but it was fleeting, and he could see an anxious look in her eyes. "I think I better stay here. I'm not feeling so well."
It was that damned Anderson kid, wasn't it?
She had been helping out with running the small school in town, reading to the younger children, while others taught the older students. Bella Anderson, a normally feisty 4-year-old, had been rosy-cheeked with fever, glassy eyes, and a runny nose when he stopped by with lunch for Angie the day before.
I swear they've got some cold or flu on a constant running basis. With 7 kids in the house, it's practically a rotating array of disease.
It's not little Bella. Angie picked up the tea, sniffed it, and then set it down again and pushed it towards him. "I can't enjoy it. My stomach's all crazy right now. You go ahead." Their fingers connected, and Wes felt a ball of wonder beginning to rotate in his stomach. Laura had been the same way with both Cody and Sarah.
Oh, shit.
He breathed it out, shock mixing with anticipation, even joy. Her eyes met his, worry and even fear so clear in her soft brown eyes.
You're pregnant, aren't you?
Do you want me to go? Her voice was childlike in that moment, and he could see she was waiting for him to give her a sign, anything that could indicate decisively how he was feeling.
Do I want you to go?
Why would she think that? And then he thought of Laura and Cody and Sarah. They had spoken of them many times, and in all of those times she had never once asked what would happen if they did come back. For that matter, he hadn't wanted to think of it either. And now the question was there in front of them, this existence, this thing that they had together. What was it? His mouth opened, and then it closed. He couldn't explain it. He couldn't put it into words, the emotions he was feeling, that if he told her how he felt about her, it meant closing the door on the life he had with his wife and children. What if they came back? This child, this baby growing inside of her, it changed everything.
I can't talk about this right now.
The words sounded harsh, distant, and they fell out of his mouth before he could stop them, before he could explain how complicated this all was, the love he felt for her, so different from the love he had felt for Laura, different because they were different people. He pulled back, hating himself as he saw his retreat in her eyes. He reached out then, took her hand, stared at how the fingers were bare of jewelry, no ring that said she was his, and his own still wearing his wedding ring. It was simply part of his hand. It had never occurred to him to take it off, not even after Angie had moved in 4 months ago. 4 months. They had done nearly everything together. She had hunted with him, sleeping on the hard ground, cussing out the mosquitoes that swarmed near Reelfoot Lake, and learned to trap right alongside him.
Stay here. I need to think. I need to...
His brain was spinning.
I just need some time, okay?
He could see the beginnings of tears in her eyes. Okay. It hadn't been the response she had obviously been hoping for, more of one she had feared.
Her fears manifested. Will I ever stop hurting the people I love?
He squeezed her hand.
I'll be back tomorrow, next day at the latest.
He grabbed his packs and left then, escaping to the woods where there were no people, no noise, nothing but the woods and him and the creatures he was hunting. All of his cares, all the things that pulled him back to civilization, they fell away, and he could think. Wes walked, each step chosen carefully. No hide this time. A bullet in the chamber, locked and loaded, and he picked up fresh tracks near the stream's edge, heading away into a deeper brush. A baby. He remembered Sarah's birth so clearly. Cody's he had missed thousands of miles away in the desert city of Kandahar when he got the news that his son had been born a month early, 2 weeks before his scheduled leave. Laura had been young, just 17, and he had gotten leave to come home and see his new wife and son, red and small and squalling. That had been his impression of him, and if he were honest, that was pretty much how he had always found Cody, at least the squalling part of it. Sarah, despite her love for baby dolls, was tougher. She'd been a happy baby, seemed impervious to pain, and had climbed trees better than her brother. He hadn't been there for them, neither of them. And he would be here, every step of the way, every moment for this one. Not fucked up or desperate for the alcohol to blunt the noise, the memories. The tracks intersected with another creature's prints, and Wes could see he was on a main thoroughfare for the animal life here. A superhighway to the watering hole. Ahead, he saw the path open up, and there at the edge of the lake, a doe and her 2 fawns had stopped to drink. He lowered his rifle. He wouldn't take a doe, not one that had babies to care for. Across the way, 100 feet away, where the land held on, fighting the lake for dominance, he saw a majestic stag. No doubt the sire of the 2 fawns that drank water silently, mere yards away from him. He lifted his rifle once again. It was a long shot, but he could see just where to put the round. There was no wind, nothing to interfere with a quick death. It would take a good 20 minutes to walk through the brush and around the edge of the lake to retrieve the kill, but it was a good one, and Wes smiled, eager to return to Angie, to say the words she needed to hear. The stag's ear twitched, but it didn't move. He closed an eye, sighted down the barrel, and focused on the place where the round would hit, center mass, slightly to the right of the breastbone, a tad elevated to account for distance. His finger tightened gently on the trigger, and in the split second before he fired, the sound of gunfire erupted from the distance. The stag wheeled around, sprinted away with a mighty crash, and was out of sight in less than a second, random crashes in the brush betraying his existence as the creature fled for its life. Wes stopped, looking in vain to see if he could see anything. It was a lot of gunfire, and it was coming from town. He dropped the 2 packs he had brought with him. They didn't have anything he couldn't retrieve later, and certainly nothing that he needed. What he did need to do was get home as quickly as possible. He ran, settling into a steady lope, a ground-eating pace he had learned in the service, one made easier by not having the 60-pound pack of camping supplies and tools on his back. The .65 Enfield was strapped to his back, and at this rate he would be back in town in less than an hour.
Too long. Gotta get there faster.
He lengthened his stride, felt his boots dig into the brush, crackling with frost, following a game trail rather than seeking the road. There had been rumors of troop movements in at least 2 directions, one from the west and others to the north. Tiptonville was small, remote even. The initial tension and attentiveness to the world around them had faded as the months stretched on, and the small town was forgotten by the world at large. An oasis of calm, it went unnoticed for so long that many had come to believe they would be able to ride out the collapse with little more than inconvenience. They had taken their peace for granted, assuming it would continue, and now, from the sound of the gunfire, the town was paying for that mistake dearly. He was winded, his heart pounding in his chest, but he continued to push his body forward, yards disappearing beneath his feet, his entire focus on returning to Angie. Would she stay inside? Or would she step out of the door, run towards danger? In the past 4 months, Angie had proved herself to be strong, capable, tough. He had shown her how to fire a gun. She had lain on the hard ground beside him, handled gutting and cleaning the kills, and even taken a buck of her own over a month ago, a clean shot to the chest, with the creature dead before it hit the ground.
Stay inside. Hide. Stay inside. Hide.
The silent plea repeated itself over and over. If only his wishes were enough to keep her safe. He faltered, his ankle a hot pulse of pain as it twisted on a rocky section of the trail. He ignored it, following the tree line, and burst out between 2 backyards, a block over from his house. The fence between the 2 yards had been on the decline for a decade, but it was helped along by a particularly strong spring storm. The neighbors, an older couple on one side and the other house long empty, had not bothered to fix it. A quick road trip to Home Depot was no longer an option. He slipped through the gaps, avoiding the fallen panels, and crossed the road. The gunfire was concentrated in the north part of town to his right.
Perhaps they haven't even come through this area.
His hopes were dashed when he saw the first body. Dowsey lay crumpled on the ground on his stomach, one gnarled, aged hand lying limp at his side, the other tucked under him. He wasn't moving, and there was a wide circle of red in the middle of his back. Wes didn't stop. He passed another and another. His heart hammered in his chest as he turned the corner, and he saw her then, her dishwater blonde hair splayed out, half on, half off of the front stoop. His Ruger, the one he had given her to practice with, lay on the ground next to her limp right hand, and blood, so much blood. If he had had any breath to spare, he would have screamed then. But each molecule of oxygen served to move him forward, to bring him to her side. He slid to a stop, his lungs desperate for more air than he could give, his heart shattering as he brought her up to him and held her against his chest. Minutes passed, time enough for his heart to slow, for his breathing to return to some semblance of normality. He sat there and held her. When he could speak again, he told her how much he loved her, that he was sorry he hadn't said it that morning, that he was a fool. He told her all the words he knew she had wanted to hear, all the words that had occurred to him on the long walk out. He spoke of his dreams, the dreams made real by the news that he had another chance, another moment, a life to spend with her and their child in this house. That he didn't want her to go anywhere, but instead be here with him. He held her, rocked her, and described what it was like to see Sarah born, to know that a piece of himself had become a person, something whole and separate from him, and that no matter what, they would make it work. And when he was done, when there were no more words, and her blood had drenched his shirt, his jeans, he laid her gently on the ground, carefully closed her eyes, and went to find the men responsible. Hours later, in the darkness, in the burning flames of the buildings the invading troops had set on fire, Wes exacted his revenge on the last 2 soldiers left. He had been far too late to catch the men responsible. Those who had commanded the troops were long gone, on to another town and better conquests. The town militia was in tatters. Their head, his former boss and ex-Marine Ethan Hurlbut, lay dead, partially crushed by the fallen water tower, his body riddled with bullets. Of all of them, Ethan's voice had been the loudest, warning of the possibility of this happening. He had been their leader, but most of the men in the militia had never seen combat. They were gun owners, hunters even, but not soldiers. The 2 soldiers, wounded, left behind when their jeep headed down the wrong side street, separated from the Western Front, if the violent, murderous remainder of the army could even be called that now. The 2 soldiers were taking a long time in dying. Both of them shot in the legs. They couldn't walk, or run, or even crawl. Hell, they couldn't escape from the jeep, which was now on the side of the road into town, pushed there after Wes had assumed leadership of what few remained of the militia. It was Wes that called for the gasoline can, and as he set fire to the jeep, he ignored the screams of the men inside as they begged for their lives. He had stood there, long after the crowd had dispersed, long after they had scuttled away back to the ruins of their homes and their lives, and he had waited for the men inside to be burned clean of their sins. He had waited until only their skeletons remained. He walked away into the dark. "Wes?" Leslie, her arm in a sling, put a hand on his arm. A new day had dawned. He hadn't slept. He'd cleaned Angie up as best as he could, but there was no water pressure left in the lines now that the water tower was down. He'd wrapped her body in a sheet, loaded her onto the tarp they'd used to bring back the deer carcasses, and begun the long walk out to Reelfoot Lake. He hadn't noticed Leslie following behind. He had dug the hole there in the first campsite he had taken her to. It was on a hill, surrounded by willow trees and carpeted in wildflowers. He had just been settling Angie's body into the grave when Leslie spoke. "I'm so sorry." Her voice was flat, her eyes bloodshot.
"She loved this place. Said it was magical."
His hands shook, and he stared at the shovel, realizing he hadn't washed the blood off of them yet. Her blood. "It's beautiful," Leslie said, her voice choking. "She is. Well, she was."
"I know. She told me."
He took the shovel and prepared to begin digging. "Those soldiers." Leslie's voice was a whisper. "The ones in the jeep."
"I thought it would make me feel better,"
he said, his eyes taking in her burns, the dried blood on Leslie's clothing, her hands.
"Seeing them burn after what they did to Angie. What they did to this town."
"And did it?"
"No."
"In war," Leslie said slowly, "there are no winners."
"No, there aren't."
And with nothing left to say, Wes dug the shovel deep into the soft earth.